What's up, YouTube? So today I'm going to be going over 1984. As you can see, I went back through and put an absurd amount of sticky notes to kind of mark where I want to talk about. I already do have a bunch of annotations in here, but I added sticky notes of some specific parts that I wanted to go over. While I was reading this book in particular, it was sort of a syntopical review or a reading for me. If anybody doesn't know what that means comparing several books together at the same time. So you're reading several books in order to like analyze better a book, and that's according to this book, How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, which is it talks about intelligent reading. That's like the highest level of reading or whatever. And I happen to have been reading this while I was reading this, so I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of take what I've learned from this and apply it while I'm reading this book in particular. And that happens to be a form of syntopical reading. So I would definitely recommend you look out this book if you're interested in it. I may do a specific review of this book, but I really enjoyed some of the annotation aspects to it. It talks about how to make your book your own, which Benjamin McAvoy actually introduced me to this book, and I thought that was very cool. I really started off with my own kind of style of marking books or whatever, and I still really do have my own kind of style, but I have added a few things specifically from this book. Something I need to implement is just numbers in the margins of pages, so you can mark like the sequence of arguments in books and stuff like that. But really, what I've implemented from this is circling. That's something I really didn't utilize in the past, and I think that's very helpful. And then vertical lines in the margins, so like this, just kind of mark important like parts of the book rather than underlining everything. If there's a big portion of the book that looks interesting, you can just do like this and just do like 3 vertical lines in the margin, or you can do 2 or whatever you like. But that's really been a cool addition for my reading. And annotation, really, it's just a very cool way to bring yourself to the book, and when you go back through it and you look at your annotations, it's just a very interesting experience. I've always done the notes in the margin, kind of just like putting my thoughts, but there's definitely some very, very good and interesting details in this book. I'll probably go back through this at some point, but that's not what we're reviewing today. But I thought I would just kind of go over a couple of the things that I was doing differently while I was reading this book. Cool. So we're just going to go through this kind of as I read it. So as you start the book, it talks about Winston, who's going to be the main character in the book, and then it starts to talk about Emmanuel Goldstein and the party and Big Brother and all of this throughout the book. Right off the bat, it shows like the slogan of the party, which is "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." And if you didn't notice, right off the bat, all of those words are contradictory statements. So like war and peace are very different. Freedom and slavery are completely opposite terms, and they're put together in contradiction. And it's kind of like sort of parallelism, I guess, there. Or juxtaposition, I mean. Yeah, so, just kind of progressing through the book. Winston starts to write in a diary that he has, and it talks about how like just that action of like writing is an instance of thought crime, and as soon as he puts words down to the page, then he's already dead. George Orwell, or his name is actually Eric Blair. I think this is a very important lesson from the How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, is to read the book in its entirety. And I think this is specifically important for this book because it contains an afterword as well as some information about the person who wrote the afterword and information about George Orwell. And if you didn't know this, George Orwell's actual name is Eric Blair. So you wouldn't have known that unless you looked it up and already knew that or read the very beginning portion of the book, which some people, will skip over. I mean, people skip over the introduction, people skip over the table of contents, and you got to remember this is all written by somebody for you to read. And additionally, if you're buying a book and it has an afterword or preface or whatever, then it's good to read it. And as far as prefaces go, I think it was Benjamin McAvoy that talked about this, but I wouldn't read the preface at the very beginning because it can give away stuff about the book that you don't know, and it kind of gives you presuppositions about the book before you read it. And but it's still good, like I would say, after you read the book, to go back and read the preface, and definitely go over the table of contents and the afterword for sure. Especially in this book, the afterword is written by Erich Fromm, and he's from the Psychoanalytic Institute in Berlin, and he escaped Nazi Germany while that was happening in World War II, and it's just, I'll talk a little bit more about the afterword as we go through the book, but it's extremely important, and I really think it adds more to the book if you read that when you read 1984. Cool. So yeah, we were talking about him writing in the book, and then I think his mind just kind of goes blank, and he's just doesn't realize he's writing on the page, and he starts with writing down with Big Brother, and Big Brother is the envisionment or the embodiment of the government, or the party as they call it in the book, and he starts to realize oh shoot, I'm done, I'm dead after writing that. But he's realized he's already committed thought crime, whether he writes down with Big Brother or whether he writes anything else. He's putting his thoughts down onto a page. And although the party hasn't ever figured out how to read people's thoughts or read people's minds, they can do pretty much everything but that. I remember in the afterword, Erich Fromm kind of talks about how they use torture to get their ends, and that's a big part of the end of the book. Is a lot of it's kind of torture, but they use the torture basically to make you tell them whatever you thought or whatever they want you to think. So that's how they control anybody that commits thought crime. And there's several other books that are syntopically compared to this book. So that's another reason why it's important to read the afterword and stuff like that. If you're looking for books that are similar to this, it's going to give you several examples, and it's very interesting. Cool. Continuing through the book, I'm probably going to read a few quotes throughout the video. So I thought this was really nice, really good quote, kind of explaining Winston's feelings as he's committing thought crime and realizing that he's already dead and going against the party. So he said he felt as though he were wandering in the forest of the sea bottom, lost in a monstrous world where he himself was the monster. And then I just wrote it's kind of horrific to become the monster just for thinking freely in this world that's envisioned by Eric Blair or George Orwell. I just saw 1430 in the book. So the times are in military time, but the very beginning of the book, it's supposed to be written something is off, because clocks, they don't strike 13. It only goes to 12 o'clock, right? Now we have digitized clocks, but this was before the invention of digital clocks, so clocks didn't strike 13. So it says it was a bright, cool day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. So it's just very odd and kind of gives you a feeling of something's out of place or amiss. The depiction of Big Brother is actually kind of interesting as well. Kind of makes it adds to it because there's several times it explains like Big Brother is just watching you all the time, and I'm sure you guys have heard that in culture because there's so many references to 1984 because of some of the things that are going on that are so similar to what Eric Blair has written. There's kind of like he's like a lot of ways he's kind of had foresight into the future as far as like what's happened. So I'll give here's a little description of Big Brother. So it says with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. So that's kind of how Big Brother is described throughout the book. And he's on all the coins, and they have his face on like the telescreens just watching you, and it's really unsettling. Here's another unsettling quote from the book. It says, "Nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull." So that, it's just really showing you that besides your own thoughts, they know everything. So like even if you make a facial expression, there's a word for it, and there's a whole language that or it's like new form of English that George Orwell has created for this book called Newspeak, where they're literally decreasing the amount of words every year, and the goal of it is to prevent thought crime. So it's supposed to limit the amount of thoughts that you can have to a certain amount of like things that are pertaining to the political ideology of the party, which is it's really interesting, and it's kind of scary because there's so many words that you can use to express yourself in the English language, and that's one of the beautiful things about English is there's always new words being created, and I actually kind of created a portmanteau, which is two words combined together to make a new word that combines their sounds and meanings together to make something else, and I called it Thex, which is just like thought expansion. So it's the expansion of thought. So creating new words to expand the reach of the human mind, so you can think more. But this book, it really outlines Newspeak as the exact opposite of this word, and it's just the cutting down of the English language to the bare bones. And something really interesting about this book as well is there's actually a pretty in-depth explanation of Newspeak in the end. So if there's some words that you're not familiar with or whatever, there's a really detailed explanation of it in the very ending of the book. But I would encourage you kind of to look up the words as you're reading. There's like maybe a couple of, I think there's one like place where it writes out what it means, but it's definitely good to read the portion talking about Newspeak because it talks about how they make all of the words like very easy to like pronounce, and really that was like what a lot of the way the words are arranged is meant to do, is to make it more easy to pronounce and again limit the amount of thought that you can have to what the party wants you to think. One particular word in Newspeak that's kind of very unsettling is it's called Dutch speak. So it means thinking or talking without like thinking or something like that. Hold on, I'll see if I can find it real quick. Principles of Newspeak. So yeah, there's a whole section that talking about the principles of Newspeak. So it means to quack like a duck. So it's like, because obviously ducks don't think, they just quack, and that's the idea behind it. And it's supposed to be, a compliment to those in the party, but in like an insult at the same time, because it means you're just speaking. You're like you're without having any thought behind it. It's kind of it's definitely very scary, and a lot of the things in this book kind of allude to, you should know. I read this like in an article online. It talks about how really one of the things that Eric Blair is trying to get at is that you need to know like English very well. Uh, when things like news articles or stuff comes out from like dictatorship governments, like in Nazi Germany, they had words that they used to like cover up the meaning of like mass graves, and one in particular that I think is very applicable to the United States is they used the word collateral damage in order to cover up civilian casualties, which there's a lot of euphemisms and things like that used and probably will be continued to use in government to cover up things that are unsettling or they deem the public shouldn't know or they don't want them to know. So they'll use, softer words in order to kind of cover up what they really mean. And so a lot of this book is kind of, making the point that you should know English well, and a lot of people don't, and that's one of the important reasons you should read. And not only read books, but also read the news. I saw something online about the Russian government trying to say the war in Ukraine was started by the United States now that they're losing the war. Which, I mean, this is obviously ridiculous, but I mean, if let's say in a theoretical scenario, Russia controlled the entire world, and like in the book, they started changing all of the news articles to reflect the United States had started the war between Russia and Ukraine. How would you know the difference if everything was changed? And besides the human mind, then all of it would have been erased. And that's what they do in the book. They correct all of the documents and they reprint them. And through a process called doublethink, which it's an actual word that's come from this book, where you have two contradictory ideas at the same time. And it talks about in the end of the book how there's doublethink already occurring when it comes to like nuclear war. So you can't it's like to where you can't really believe in denuclearization, because if we don't have nuclear weapons, the consequence of not having them is worse than having nuclear weapons, even though you take the risk of one of those nuclear weapons exploding and killing thousands of people or more, but it would be less than having an actual nuclear war. So in that way, they think it's better to have nuclear weapons, and they think it's it's just ignorant to think of denuclearization, which obviously isn't the case, but it just shows that doublethink occurs within society already. So here's another quote from, he's an interesting character in the book called Syme, and he's kind of seeing over the 11th edition of Newspeak, and it talks in the end about how everything will be, it talks in the book as well, but it says the entire old speak language will be obsolete by 2050, and everybody will only be speaking Newspeak. And he says it's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words, and it's interesting and unsettling at the same time. There's this language that George Orwell created for this book, but at the same time, most people that like literature or are writers or anything like journalists, anything like that, really enjoy the multitude of words that you can use to express yourself in the English language. And it's just a very interesting way to show what the government is trying to do in this book by limiting the amount of words you can use. Something really interesting, I think that the author's trying to get at kind of is all of the books like Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton and Byron, those are the examples he gives in the book, will all be rewritten in Newspeak. So when you read Shakespeare right now, you go and you read it in the Old English, but it would remove the original meaning if you rewrote it in how we would speak today. Like, when I'm reading Shakespeare, sometimes if there's something that I don't understand, I'll look up the line, or there's like websites that translate it to modern English so you can understand it. But it's kind of spitting in the face of the author by doing that, and it's almost more beneficial for you to create your own interpretation of it and read it in the original Old English. And it's fun. It's kind of similar to how they're doing it with Newspeak, but obviously it's not to the degree of completely eliminating words, but it's just I guess it kind of is, because we don't use Old English anymore, but there's a lot of archaic words and stuff like that in the book, or in Shakespeare, for instance. And what if the government said, we're no longer using these words, we're going to rewrite Shakespeare? There would be an outrage in the literary community. So an interesting little bit of the book is it's Aronson, Rutherford, and Jones, and they were, I guess, rebels. Yeah, they said they could invest intelligence with the enemy. So basically, they were basically, the government, when they catch people with thought crime, they make them confess through torture to like pretty much everything. So they confessed all of this, and the main character Winston had seen them in the cafe, and it's playing this tune, and it's under this spreading chestnut tree. I sold you, and you sold me. There lie they, and here lie we, under the spreading chestnut tree. And it's the Chestnut Cafe that they're in. That's where that little rhyme comes from. But it's alluding to them selling each other out to the government. And that's what they do with Winston as well. If you haven't read the book yet, this part's going to be kind of a spoiler. A lot of this is going to be kind of spoiling some of it, but I've kind of been a little bit, just going over the introductory portion and some of the Newspeak stuff up until right now, but I'm going to go over the ending right now. So if you're wanting to read the book, either skip over this part or read the book and come back to it. But in the end, this same tune is being played in the cafe again when Winston is released from the torture chambers of the government, and has confessed, and like emaciated and all this stuff. And he has the same like tear running down his face from remembering that he sold out Julia, and she sold out him, and that's how they released them from the torture chambers. But really sad, and kind of the book is it's very morbid, and I know this is part of the literary modernist movement, and that was at the time that this was written, after World War One, with Russia and Eurasia and the Ottoman Empire. I said Eurasia. Been reading this too much. Eurasia is one of the super states in the book, but with all the allies and Europe, and I have some stuff written down about the World War One, but basically it was the first war where every country was involved in, pretty much. Like Austria was the company that was warring with the United States and Russia and all of them. So this is kind of I think it was after like some of the atomic wars as well, and George Orwell kind of predicts, he talks about how the governments in this book just continue to create weapons, and that's the only form of new invention is just creating more powerful and destructive weapons. And so in this way, he kind of predicts the creation of nuclear weapons, which he says specifically something about the government. Their main goal is to create weapons that can kill millions in a few seconds, which they have, and they will continue to do. Here, I'll read the specific quote. It says, "Has merely continued to produce atomic bombs and store them up against the decisive opportunity which they all believe will come sooner or later. It remains the aim of the ruling party to discover how to kill several 100 million people in a few seconds without giving warning beforehand. And this was before the discovery of thermonuclear weapons that George Orwell wrote in 1984 and kind of predicted this. So, very interesting. The three superstates in the book are Eurasia, Eastasia, and Oceania. It's kind of good to know that Oceania is like the Americas, then Eurasia is European and like the Asian land masses, and then Eastasia is China and the Japanese islands. And then, so in the beginning of the book, they're at war with Eurasia. Oceania is at war with Eurasia, but it gets to a point in the book where they just change it and they're at war with Eastasia, and it's like they've always been at war with Eastasia, and it has that double thing that everybody that thought they were at war with Eurasia has the contradictory thought that they've always been at war with Eastasia and not with Eurasia, and Eurasia is the ally. And it talks about how those who control the present control the past. So basically, whoever's in power controls history, and there's been some similar things written about that. Like I'm sure you've heard the phrase, "The winners write history," and that's kind of the same thing that they put in this book. And I think that's kind of another hint that George Orwell is trying to get at is you should read history because really it only exists in your mind. And if people don't continue to write about history and learn about it and know about it, then it's just going to fade into nothingness. And whoever writes about it is going to be correct because that's the only thing that exists. So, I mean, if they wrote something that wasn't true, someone else who knew what was correct would have to come along and correct what they've written. Another point, they have like a lottery for the proletariat. They call them the proles, and proletariat is just like the working class, but the lottery is like largely imaginary, and it's just used to like keep them occupied. So I'm gonna give something away again, so if you want to skip over this, but it talks about what's his name, Mr. Harrington, and he owns like the shop where Winston went and bought the book. When I say the book, I mean the notebook that he's writing in. And it says, "The frame's fixed to the wall," said the old man, "but I could unscrew it for you, I dare say." But and then it just kind of breezes past that. But like in retrospect, you realize that behind the painting is the telescreen that's watching them when they rent the room from him. And Mr. Harrington is actually a thought police agent, which that was a crazy twist. I really did not expect Mr. Harrington to be an agent of the thought police, just because he's an old man and he runs like the antique shop, and the way he's written, he just seems very genuine. So that's really interesting. At one point, he visits like another old man in a pub trying to get information about what it was like as a capitalist country before Ingsoc. Ingsoc is like the ideology of the party, and that's basically means English socialism, so it's an entirely socialist state. And it is kind of like a political warning. The whole book is a political warning about, keeping your individualism and not letting whatever you work for. Like I remember reading something in the book about how like industrialization, you kind of like when you're at a company, you're like, okay, this is the best product, and it kind of takes over your identity. And then whoever else you work for next, like, okay, now this is the best product instead of the other one, although you worked at a different one before, and it has that kind of double think. But because it's totalitarian, like the government, like it depends on unquestionable servitude. And so something I kind of wrote was about the war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. It says the totalitarian control war keeps the public occupied. So like the public is sort of occupied with this eternal war, which really doesn't produce anything other than expending resources. And it talks about in so like the book by the Brotherhood, which is actually written by several people, and what's his name, O'Brien as well. It talks about hold on, give me a second, I lost my train of thought. So yeah, how like the war is continuous, and it's really not about defeating each other. It's about they're fighting for the public workforce. So really, what they're fighting for is an endless supply of like proletariat workers rather than anything. And the whole point of the war is to expend resources so that they can't have eternal peace. So they're at a point in like history in the book to where they could literally provide everything needed and no one would have to work, which is like the idea behind socialism, right? But rather than doing this, they just have an eternal war where they expend resources and fight over the public workers or the proletariat class, so they can have endless work for them. Then I wrote, freedom allows the public reign to think and conspire. And intelligence leads to rebellion. So it kind of talks about later in the book how being intelligent in the proletariat class, if you're like too intelligent, they'll basically just kill you or brainwash you into by torture. And I wrote, dictatorships want dogmatic subservience, so like unquestionable like servants to the government. Okay, so then let's go on. So then he realizes that Julia is not a thought agent. She's been like following him around and stuff. And then I kind of thought it was interesting how quickly his feelings change for her when he realizes she actually like loves him or whatever. And I kind of wrote like right before she actually gave him a note that said like, I love you, I thought that she might like him or something. And so I was kind of onto something there, I guess. But I didn't expect her to say like write the note that says I love you, so I thought that was interesting. So through a good portion of the book, they're kind of just politically rebelling against the government through their relationship. And in the end, they use their relationship against them. And that's what like makes them be released, is they give each other up to the to the government, rather don't torture me, torture them instead, which is kind of, it's pretty awful. But another like foreshadowing that I kind of missed, but in retrospect, like looking back, it makes like a lot of sense. So the painting that has the telescreen behind it in the room they rent from Mr. Harrington, they said Julia actually says I'm gonna say it says, I bet that picture's got bugs behind it. So it makes a lot of sense, because when it says it's got bugs behind it, it means that he's alluding to the picture it's bugged, as in it has the telescreen behind it, and they hear everything that they're saying. And that's foreshadowing to when they take the picture off, then that's where the telescreen was the whole time. But this is kind of an interesting bit of foreshadowing that you may miss the first time around, but when you go back through and you kind of look at what you've written, or you kind of just like breeze back through it, you're like, oh. So Syme actually vanished. So he was the guy that's writing the 11th edition of Newspeak, and I really didn't expect him to be evaporated. That's what they call it when you become like an unperson, is what they call it, as in like you don't exist anymore. Supposedly they either kill you, send you to like a work camp, or they can just like put you back out there. But like they like brainwash you through torture into like thinking what they want you to think, basically, and confessing to whatever crimes that they want you to confess. But I thought we would see him again once I started reading about the Winston going to jail, but we actually didn't see him again. Someone that was interesting that I did see once more in towards the end was shoot, I forget his name, but he's kind of like the dumb one, and so he committed thought crime by saying "down with Big Brother" in his sleep, and it talks about how like their children are kind of well, they're brainwashed as well, so they're taught to like basically inform on their parents that they catch them with like thought crime, and so it's kind of like what's the word weaponize the family, which is pretty crazy. So something that was interesting that I kind of read about in the book, and I looked it up at first because I was wondering what was the deal with the bombs like hitting the city and like collapsing stuff to rubble. And then Julia later in the book, she says the rocket bombs which fell daily on London were probably fired by the government in Oceania itself, just to keep people frightened. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. It's not from the war, but supposedly it's just from the government to like keep people afraid because of the war and focused on that rather than thinking about anything else. So it talks a lot about how like they're already dead, like Julia and Winston are like already dead, but at the same time they don't want like they talked about like possibly like killing themselves so they don't ever get caught, and but really the thing is people want to like live as long as they can, pretty much no matter what, and I think that's just an interesting part of the book. So I think this is a big part of kind of what Eric Blair or George Orwell is afraid of too. It says every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book has been rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street and building has been renamed, every date has been altered. Nothing exists except an endless present. The party is always right. So the idea behind this is like everything is changed into an ideological symbolization of the party. So every like work of literature is written in Newspeak. So everything is like ideological rather than sometimes you just read something and it's a work of literature, and it really doesn't contain allusions to any kind of like political ideology, but through the way that they rewrite everything in Newspeak, everything is like pertaining to the party and English socialism, and so it would remove any kind of political ideology that went against it. And then it talks about in the very end of the book as well, like they literally could not rewrite the Declaration of Independence because it just contains concepts that are contradictory to English socialism. Here it is, actually, right here. It says, it would have been impossible to render this into Newspeak while keeping its sense to the original. And it says it would literally just sum up the whole of the Declaration of Independence into crime think. Because it says we have unalienable rights, inalienable, and then liberty in the pursuit of happiness. So like liberty means like freedom to choose whatever belief or political opinion you want, and freedom isn't a word in like you like it doesn't have meaning in Newspeak because freedom is slavery. So it's and it says governments. So basically, I remember like it says this too in the Declaration of Independence that it is the right of the people to alter or abolish and to institute a new government if the government is destructive. And this is like it's so against the party that they couldn't rewrite it because it's saying that the party should be overthrown basically because of the point it's gotten to. So continuing through the story, it gets to like the point where O'Brien, like he kind of like bumps into Winston and like says, in one way or another, I think he gives him a note saying that like there will be a misprint in something, and he'll give him the book of the Brotherhood. And it's kind of funny too, because when I was reading it through the first time, I was like, and I was reading through like there's like portions of the book by the Brotherhood. Talking about English socialism and like the chapters are labeled as like ignorance is strength, war is peace, and it kind of outlines what the party is about basically, and it talks about how like experimentation is stopped, and really their only goal is to create the only like new form of invention is more like destructive weapons, and it talks about how the only way that the government could be overthrown is by the proletariat, who would have to think and like realize that they're being oppressed by the government. But later, O'Brien, you find out, is actually part of the party, and that there's no way that the proletariat will ever overthrow the government, basically. And it's really interesting too, because like you're reading through the book, and you're like, oh, this is cool. This is like actually a book inside of a book, and this is the ideals of the Brotherhood. But in reality, it's supposed to be just a sum up of the party by several different authors, since nothing is written by one singular author in this book. And I wrote at the beginning, I was like, because you kind of think, so is Emmanuel Goldstein really, is he real, or is he just a figment of the party for them to hate? Just like something to, channel and funnel their hatred towards, and just keep them focused on that, which is why they have like the 2 minutes of hate. They're like, okay, we hate this guy, we're at war with Eurasia, and then they're like, actually, we're at war with East Asia, we hate them, and it's very, very crazy. And it's really interesting that O'Brien was actually a member, like a prominent member of the party, because it really kind of it makes you think that he is really with the Brotherhood, and once he comes in contact with them, you're like, oh, cool, they're actually gonna be getting out of the system or whatever, and like you're really kind of rooting for them. And then they get caught while they're in the room reading the book, and Mr. Harrington, or I think it's Mr. Charrington actually. No, I think it's Mr. Harrington. Let me see. No, yeah, it is Mr. Charrington. I kept saying Mr. Harrington, but yeah, it's really interesting that he's a thought police too, because he's just an old man running like an antique shop, and at least like in modern day now, when you encounter someone like that, you just kind of assume that they're a good person, and it's really a nice like twist that they put in there. Okay, so then this is the portion like after they get caught and sent to the Ministry of Love, which this is really interesting too. So it talks about in the end how like the Ministry of Truth, the Ministry of Love, and the Ministry of Peace are all like the opposites of their words. So like the Ministry of Truth is where they correct all of the news to reflect like what the party wants, and then the Ministry of Peace is actually the Ministry of War that conducts war, and then the Ministry of Love is where they torture people to think what the party wants them to think. So that's really interesting, just the contradictions in the ministries that they have. So something that was really, this, like, the ending of the book is really macabre. It's just like very surreal, and because you're just reading through it and they're just like getting like tortured, and like just terrible things are happening to them. And there's this guy Bumstead, and he tries to give this like starving man a piece of bread, and then the thought police come and they say drop the bread, and they just like slam him with like a nightstick. There's another word for it, but trying to find the word for it. It's just a nightstick. We're just gonna call it that. I'm not gonna dwell on it. Oh yeah, so another part is like Winston just like for a while he's just sitting there starving and watching these people be dragged away into room 101. And throughout the book you're like, okay, well, what is in room 101? You're just imagining some kind of torture for the most part. And towards the end, like when he's about to get out of the place, O'Brien reveals, like, he's like, you already know what's in room 101. It's the worst thing ever. It's like your biggest, okay, here it is. So it says the thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world. And so like the worst thing in the world is supposed to be like different for each person. And it kind of alludes to Winston's like hatred of rats, and he's like afraid of them when like Julia and him are in a room together, and he's just like absurdly afraid of this rat because like supposedly they'll like eat children or like attack them and stuff like that. And they have like this like mask, and like it's pretty scary, like envisioning it in your mind. It's because like, I think like your brain just makes like an amalgamation of like the words that the author uses, and it just makes it that much more terrifying. But like the mask is filled with rats, and it has like these gates, and it opens up, and basically he's threatening to put this mask on his face and like let the rats like burrow through his skull because they're starving and they're like eat him, and it's just pretty terrible. But and like they just want him to like, really what they wanted him to do was give up Julia, which is where the you sold me, I sold you comes in. And so in the end he's like, do it to Julia, not me. I don't care what you do to her. Tear her face off, strip her bones. So basically they wanted him to like betray her, because they said that they can't take away their love for each other, and it's like they're like, all right, you can't have that. We can't have you like having love for other people. They want to completely control every aspect of like human thought and emotion, which is where the whole idea comes from, where they try to take all of the good parts of like sex and like relationships out of marriage and having relationships, which like that's why they have like any like marriages that they have in the book are between like people that they don't like each other at all. So that's, and really like the only reason that they have for like people like being married is like solely for producing like children, if like the continuation of the party. Okay, so yeah, at the very end of the book, Julia and Winston actually meet each other again, and they just talk, and they say like, I betrayed you, and like they said, I betrayed you. And it's just so awkward that they never see each other again. And so the party accomplished, like getting rid of their relationship, which was their goal with the thing that they hated the most. It doesn't ever talk about what Julia was afraid of the most, but I'm sure it was pretty terrible. It kind of leaves that to the imagination. Um, right before like the end part where he's like tortured into giving up Julia, he like basically he's like tricked his mind into double think of everything that he believed, and he just writes down freedom is slavery, two and two make five, and God is power. So like that's the idea behind the party, is that the god of their party is power, and that's what like Big Brother is too. Like Big Brother is supposed to be the it's basically makes the party immortal, and that's why they created him. And then the whole two and two make five thing, while they're torturing him, they're like, how many fingers am I holding up? And it's four. But Winston says five, or Winston says four, and he's like, no, it's five. Like basically, you're supposed to believe whatever the party tells you. So two and two makes five, and it's kind of interesting too because I was reading another book for class, Notes on the Other, Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and it talks about 2 plus 2 is 4, and that's unquestionable. In that book, and it's funny how like similar that like idea is written in this. It kind of makes me wonder if Eric Blair had read that by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I'm not sure when that was translated to English, but it's interesting how similar some of the concepts were that are talked about there. And then at the end of the book, it's the under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me. And Winston is just sitting there like getting drunk on gin, and like he looks awful because he's just been tortured so much. Like obviously he's probably like fatter and like fuller now, and supposedly they gave him like a job where I can't remember the word that they use for it, but it's basically like unimportant, and but he makes more money. So like they let him go, but like he's been brainwashed into believing what the party believes. And it says at the very end something like it's really haunting. It says he had won a victory over himself. He loved Big Brother, and that's what they wanted. Like they're like they asked him like, do you hate Big Brother? Like you'd be honest because we'll be able to tell. And that's like the whole idea behind the torture, is they want you to love the government. It's pretty awful. It says 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the side of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Pretty awful. And it's really interesting too, like how many like phrases are used from this book. In modern like talk and speak, like modern conversations is what I'm trying to say, that you don't like recognize are from this book, but you hear them all the time. Like Big Brother used like to refer to the government is it's something I've heard throughout my entire life, but I didn't know it was specifically from this book until I read it. And then like double speak is I'm not sure, I feel like I've come across it before, but it's literally become a word in the English language, and it just shows the impact of this book. And another thing, like you'll hear people compare modern world to 1984, like so often. It's just like very, very often alluded to, because it's so applicable to so many things that have happened. Like the government has gone on creating weapons until the point where we have the nuclear weapons that can kill like millions of people, at the blink of an eye. Okay, so yeah, we'll move on to that. So it has a pretty big portion talking about Newspeak. So that's really interesting, and explains that Ingsoc is English socialism, which I already knew because I think I looked it up, and it might say it in the book, but I just wanted to know what it meant. But those are the principles of the party. So, again, I think it's really important to read the afterword, just because there's so many enlightening things in it. So it's written by Erich Fromm, and I read something about he like discovered some psychological organization or something, and he's really intelligent dude, and he left the Nazi Germany for the United States. which is very brave as well. And unfortunately, he's passed away as well. But he's written several books, and it's like a whole nother like part of the book that they like give you. It's like adding another article for free at the end of the book, in my opinion. So that's another reason why you should read the entirety of the book. If you don't read like the afterword and the preface and just the whole book, then I mean you're missing part of what you bought. And it's just, I mean, like, if I hadn't read the afterword, I would have no idea that like how valuable it was to read. So I'll read parts of it, just the parts that are really important, I think. So it says the warning basically from the book is that unless the course of history changes, men all over the world will lose their human qualities and will become soulless automatons and will not even be aware of it. So this is like the true fear of George Orwell, is that like the industrialization of the United States and our continuation to be like more associated with what we work, with what we do for work, or either believing in government and not like thinking for ourselves. We would just become like an automaton, which is a human imitation. And like, if you think of that, that's just like it's like a terrifying idea. Like we have like humans walking around that like don't think for themselves. They duck speak. They just talk and they don't have any thought behind it. So that's very terrifying. So George Orwell was, or not George Orwell, but yeah, George Orwell or Eric Blair was an atheist while he was alive, and I think it talks about universal peace and justice are the goals of man, and the prophets have faith that in spite of all errors and sins, eventually the end of days will arrive, symbolized by the figure of the Messiah. And it's just, I mean, like the whole idea behind Christianity, it's like, it's a form of like groupthink. It's like they want you to believe in the idea that everything is going to come to an end and there'll be eternal peace. So like this world doesn't matter. And I think that's part of like what they're trying to say here. But I'm trying to read through it a little bit. It's just talking about like social perfection instead of like individual perfection. But yeah, I think it's very good rather than allowing whatever traditions you've been taught to think for yourself and be individualistic. And I think a good portion of that is taken away by religion. So I'm not gonna dwell on that, but that's just what I believe. And I think. Well, Eric Blair, while he was alive, he was a humanist, so that's kind of something I've tried to take to heart too. It's just like be good to other people because you want to be good to other people. The golden rule. I mean, everybody thinks that's from Christianity. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain that's not from Christianity. It's just be good to other people. Treat people how you want to be treated. And the idea behind Christianity is that you're good to other people because you have to be or you'll go to hell. But if you don't believe in that, you're just good to people because you want to be good to people. You want to be a good person. You want people to like you, and you just want to see your fellow man like achieve great things and lead good lives. And I think that is what we should strive for. It's just being good to be good, not for any particular reason, but just solely because you want to be good and see your fellow man succeed and thrive. So this is after the war, like the First World War, or is either after or around the time when it was. I think it was written after it was concluded, but that was an awful time. Hundreds of thousands of people died during those wars, and it's just, I mean, it kind of bred that hopelessness for the human race, just because we have these people going off and dying over, pointless things. I have like some stuff written down about World War One. I remember it was started because the Archduke of Ferdinand, like Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb. What was his name? I have that written down somewhere too. But basically, yeah, a Bosnian Serb assassinated the Archduke of Ferdinand, and then Austria-Hungary held Serbia responsible, and that is what started World War One. And it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, obviously it's like you shouldn't, like, killing people is terrible, and I mean that's what started the war. But I mean, it was just one instance that started a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people for no reason, and it's awful. I mean, it's pointless. Wars, I mean, like, we're fighting over things like oil or like resources or whatever, or like right now Russia trying to take over Ukraine, and it's just pointless. It's like pointless deaths over very minuscule things very often, and it'll continue to happen. And that's just the reality of the situation. But then it talks about the Bolsheviks and all that stuff. So it was a war between Russia, France, UK, Japan, and the US, who were the allies, versus the Central Powers, which was the Ottoman Empire, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And it was just an awful, awful amount of people that were killed in the war. So it says an estimated 9 million people were killed and 23 million were wounded. So it's just an awful amount of death over something so small. Just like, obviously assassination is a big thing, but it's just because one country, held another country responsible, and they were like, okay, now we're going to war, and we're going to drag all of these other countries in and create millions of deaths. So it's pretty terrible. This idea of war being terrible it's really summed up very well in this afterword. It says, in other words, war is horrible, and that is very true. It says, so yeah, we build like a large part of our income and energy to make thermonuclear weapons, which are capable of killing hundreds of thousands of people in seconds. And I wrote down how many people several nuclear bombs could kill, just to kind of, show you what they're capable of and how awful they are. But they're like hundreds or thousands of times stronger than atomic bombs, which were, which they had during when George Orwell or Eric Blair was alive. And those, like atomic bombs, would kill, when they were used, 90 to 166,000 people, which is awful. And so then think of that times hundreds or thousands for nuclear weapons. So several would kill tens of millions of people, leveling modern cities. That is absolutely terrible. And then another risk of having these nuclear weapons that it talks about in the afterword is they could blow up and destroy like a third of the population of whatever city that they're in. And it goes on to talk about like the doublethink that's involved in that, and it says like it's already something that we have because it's thought as ignorant to believe we can work towards denuclearization. So it's necessary for us to have nuclear weapons because it would be far more catastrophic not to have them if a foreign country decided to use them and destroy millions of people. So yeah, the afterword, it talks about like a lot of that, and it talks about a few other books that are similar. talks about Thomas More's Utopia, which is kind of, I guess, similar to this style of book. But really, yeah, the overall goal of the book is to show you that you need to keep your individualism and think for yourself and read, whether that's news, whether that's books, so that you can decipher what the government is putting out. And I think this is really important. Like one of the reasons why I read 1984, Christopher Hitchens, he had a big speech about why you should read George Orwell, and he talked about the euphemisms that they've used in the past, like governments have used, like the Nazi government. They used like crazy amounts of disgusting words to describe like mass graves and all of this like horrific things, like the Death March. That's a euphemism for what they did to the Jewish people when they marched them from like camp to camp, and like, you know, however many, like thousands of people died on the way there. So but I think it shows you that you need to interpret the news for yourself, and you need to know like words in English, and you just need to be intelligent, because otherwise, if you don't know what's going on, the government will tell you, and how are you to decide whether what they say is really true or not. But it's just such a good book. I mean, it's really, really interesting. There's so many like things that are applicable today. Something that I thought was really applicable and interesting is the creation of AI that can like match human voice. So there's a division of the thought police in the book that are they're good at like recreating voices, and so that's actually something that exists today. So I mean, if you think about it like that, if someone wanted to recreate your like someone's voice in order to like falsify evidence, it could be easily done with AI. So I mean, they could like have you say whatever they wanted without the need of a division of people to do that. So it's just really good. It really makes you think about like some of the connections to modern day, and it makes you remember that you should be interpreting the news for yourself and not letting news outlets or the government or whoever else interpret that. That's why it's good to read several different news sources and stay up to date on things. And yeah, absolutely phenomenal book. I guess I've kind of gushed about it quite a bit. I did read Animal Farm when I was younger in high school. I may have to reread it, and I know there's other books of his that I want to look into. Another important thing in books, look at like the books they recommend. I think it's a great way to find new books if you're like looking for something else to read. A lot of like these publishing companies, like this is Signet Classics, they recommend like 20 other books. So if you're looking for something else to read, you just go to the back and look. And then it also puts the works of George Orwell as well. So then you can just go and pick out another one that you want to read of his, if you're looking for more of Eric Blair or George Orwell. But that's pretty much it. I really enjoyed this book. If you're looking for something that's like very applicable to modern day, and it's gonna challenge you, and it's also just a terrific read. It encapsulates you into the book. Really makes you feel like you're there. You really feel for the characters. It's really well written, and it's just a great it's so good. And I mean, the warning it gives for you to be individualistic and think for yourself is one that I think is invaluable. So definitely check it out. Let me know what you think. If you have any comments or questions, definitely leave them in the comments. I would recommend what I've been doing lately. When I have time, I'll turn on the audiobook of whatever book I had just read or I'm reading through, and I'll listen through it as well. And I think that kind of gives you another level of depth to the book. I definitely think you should read it as well, because it's just a different experience. But definitely give some audiobooks a shot, because a lot of things like this you can find on YouTube for free and just listen to the whole thing with ads. And yeah, I think that's really great. I really like the frontispiece. That's a word in this book actually. That just means the illustration on the cover. And I think this is supposed to be like the eye of Big Brother. But that's a really cool addition. And yeah, it's just phenomenal. I really recommend you read it. I may read next. I'm thinking about reading either Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, or there's a couple others I was thinking about, but I kind of want to read. I think Germante's Way is the next in the series of In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. So I may try that one day next. But if you have any book recommendations, definitely drop them in the comments. I really have an absurd amount of books that I want to get to, but it's such a great and like fulfilling experience to read. And something that it talks about How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. I'll probably review this one as well. It talks about how when you're reading a book, it's kind of bringing you up to the level of the author. Like you're trying to understand and like read and learn from the author, and it's really good. It's also good if you're like wanting to learn and grow as a reader to read books that are higher level than you. So kind of make sure you're reading books that are difficult for you, and that's what's going to make you grow as a reader. And I'm really going to try to do that. So I'm going to try to pick something that's going to be very difficult for me to read next. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Definitely check out 1984, and definitely leave some comments about some books you'd like me to check out in the future. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.